Wizardry is a series of role-playing video games, developed by Certec, which were highly influential in the evolution of modern console and computer role-playing games. The original Wizardry was a significant influence on early console RPGs such as Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy. Originally made for the Apple II, the games were later ported to other platforms. The last official game in the series by Certec, Wizardry 8, was originally released for Microsoft Windows and is currently available for play on Mac and Linux via bundled emulation. There have since been various spin-off titles released only in Japan. Development: Wizardry began as a simple dungeon crawl by Andrew C. Greenberg and Robert Woodhead. It was written when they were students at Cornell University and then published by Certec. The game was influenced by earlier games from the Plato system, most notably Oubliette. The earliest installments of Wizardry were very successful, as they were the first graphically rich incarnations of Dungeons & Dragons type gameplay for home computers. The release of the first version coincided with the height of D&D's popularity in North America. The first 5 games in the series were written in Apple Pascal, an implementation of UCSD Pascal. They were ported to many different platforms by writing UCSD Pascal implementations for the target machines. David W. Bradley took over the series after the 4th installment, adding a new level of plot and complexity. Issued games Original series Ultimately the initial game became a series. The following games were released in the United States: Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, Wizardry 2, The Knight of Diamonds, Wizardry 3, Legacy of Lilgman, Wizardry 4, The Return of Werdner, Wizardry V, Heart of the Maelstrom, Wizardry 6, Bane of the Cosmic Forge, Wizardry 7, Crusaders of the Dark Savant, Nemesis, The Wizardry Adventure, Wizardry 8. The first 3 games are a trilogy, with similar settings, plots, and gameplay mechanics. A second trilogy is formed by installments 6 through 8 Bane of the Cosmic Forge, Crusaders of the Dark Savant and Wizardry 8 with settings and gameplay mechanics that differed greatly from the first trilogy. The fourth game, The Return of Werdner, was a significant departure from the rest of the series. In it, the player controls Werdner, the evil wizard slain in the first game, and summons groups of monsters to aid him as he fights his way through the prison in which he had been held captive. Rather than monsters, the player faced typical adventuring parties, some of which were pulled from actual user discs sent to Certec for recovery. Further, the player had only a limited number of keystrokes to use to complete the game. 1996's Wizardry Nemesis was an even more significant departure from the rest of the series. It is played as a solo adventure, one character only, with no supporting party or monsters. All players use the same character without the ability to choose class or attributes. In addition, the game contains only 16 spells, compared to 50 in the first 4 adventures and more in the subsequent ones. It is also the first Wizardry title where the player saw enemies in advance and thus could try to avoid them. Collections The following compilations were also released for various platforms: Wizardry Trilogy, the first 3 Wizardry games. Released for Apple II and C64, Wizardry Trilogy 2, compilation of Wizardry V, 6, and 7, all of which were developed by D. W. Bradley. Released for DOS, Wizardry, Lilgman Saga, an enhanced remake of the first 3 Wizardry games for PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Windows. The Ultimate Wizardry Archives, compilation of the first 7 Wizardry games plus the 1996 remake of the 7th game, Wizardry Gold. Released for Windows and DOS, Wizardry, New Age of Lilgman, an enhanced remake of Wizardry 4 and V for PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Windows. Series in Japan Translated by ASCII Entertainment. The Wizardry series became very influential in Japan during the 1980s even as its popularity at home declined. When first introduced, the game suffered from the culture barrier compounded by low-quality translation. This meant that the game was taken seriously by players who overlooked the in-game jokes and parodies. For example, Blade Cuisinaut was introduced in early games as a legendary sword made by the famous blacksmith, Cuisinaut, Sick, but its meaning was misinterpreted because Cuisinart food processes were virtually unknown in Japan. However, this misconception appealed to early computer gamers who were looking for something different and made the Wizardry series popular. Conversely, the fourth game, The Return of Werdner, was poorly received, as, lacking the knowledge of subcultures necessary to solving the game, Japanese players had no chance of figuring out some puzzles. The popularity of Wizardry in Japan inspired several original sequels, spin-offs, and ports, with the series long outliving the American original. Ports of the original scenarios, Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, a Euro Macintosh, MZ2500, X1/Turbo, FM7, FM77, PC8801, PC9801, MSX2, NES, Game Boy Color, Wonder Swan Color, Cellphone, C64 per carat 128, Wizardry 2, The Knight of Diamonds, a Euro Macintosh, MZ2500, X1/Turbo, FM7, FM77, PC8801, PC9801, MSX2, NES, Game Boy Color, C64, Wizardry I and 2, a Euro PC Engine, Wizardry 3, Legacy of Lingman, a Euro X1/Turbo, FM7, FM77, PC8801, PC9801, MSX2, Famicom, Game Boy Color, C64, Wizardry 4, The Return of Werdner, a Euro X1/Turbo, FM7, FM77, PC8801, PC9801, Wizardry 3 and 4, a Euro PC Engine, Wizardry V, Heart of the Maelstrom, a Euro FM Towns, PC8801, PC9801, SNES, PC Engine. C64, Wizardry 6, Bane of the Cosmic Forge, a Euro FM Towns, PC9801, 98 Note, J3100, SNES, Wizardry 6 and 7, a Euro Sega Saturn, Wizardry 7, Crusaders of the Dark Savant, a Euro PC9801, PC9821, PlayStation, Wizardry Nemesis, a Euro Microsoft Windows, Sega Saturn, Wizardry, Story of Lingman, a Euro SNES, 1999, Wizardry, Lingman Saga, a Euro Microsoft Windows, PlayStation, Sega Saturn, Wizardry, New Age of Lingman, a Euro Microsoft Windows, PlayStation, spin-offs, Wizardry Gaiden 1, Suffering of the Queen, a Euro Game Boy, Wizardry Gaiden 2, Curse of the Ancient Emperor, a Euro Game Boy, Wizardry Gaiden 3, Scripture of the Dark, a Euro Game Boy, Wizardry Gaiden 4, Throb of the Demon's Heart, a Euro SNES, Wizardry, Dimkiwil, a Euro PlayStation, Wizardry Empire, a Euro PlayStation, Game Boy Color, Wizardry Empire 2, Fukatsu no Sue, a Euro PlayStation, Game Boy Color, Wizardry Empire 3, a Euro PlayStation 2, Wizardry Chronicle, a Euro Microsoft Windows, Wizardry Summoner, a Euro Game Boy Advance, Wizardry, Tale of the Forsaken Land, a Euro PlayStation 2, Bizon Zero, Wizardry Alternative Neo, a Euro PlayStation 2, Wizardry Traditional, a Euro Cellphone, Wizardry Traditional 2, a Euro Cellphone, Wizardry XTH Academy of Frontier, a Euro PlayStation 2, Wizardry Asterisk, Yairo no Far in, a Euro Nintendo DS, Wizardry Gaiden, Prisoners of the Battles, a Euro PlayStation 2, Wizardry Summoner, a Euro PlayStation 2, Wizardry XTH2 Unlimited Student, a Euro PlayStation 2, Wizardry Empire 3, Honoka Ifu, a Euro PSP, Wizardry Torawarashi Tamasha no Mikyu, a Euro PSN, Wizardry Saimu no Kwazabi, a Euro DS, Wizardry Bakye Kunoa-san, a Euro DS, Wizardry, Torawarashi Bore no Maki, a Euro PSN. Wizardry, Prisoners of the Lost City, a Euro PSN, Wizardry Online, a Euro MMORPG, Windows. Reception: the original Wizardry game was a success, selling 24,000 copies by June 1982, just 9 months after its release according to Soft Talk, a Euro sales surveys. In the June 1983 issue of Electronic Games, Wizardry was described as without a doubt, the most popular fantasy adventure game for the Apple II at the present time. While noting limitations such as the inability to divide the party, or the emphasis on combat over role-playing, The magazine stated that no other game comes closer to providing the type of contest favored by most players of non-electronic role-playing games. One outstanding programming achievement, and an absolute must-buy for those fantasy gamers who own an Apple. Fans included Robin Williams, Harry Anderson, and the Crown Prince of Bahrain. The latter even called Sir Tech on the phone. The series was ranked as the 60th top game by Next Generation in 1996. Legacy Innovation in gameplay Wizardry established the command-driven battle system with a still image of the monster being fought. This system would be emulated in later games, such as The Bard's Tale, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy. The party-based combat in Wizardry also inspired Richard Garriott to include a similar party-based system in Ultima 3, Exodus. Wizardry was the first game to feature what would later be called prestige classes. Aside from the traditional classes of fighter, mage, priest, thief and bard, players could take bishop, lord, ninja and samurai if they had the right attributes and alignment. In the case of Lord and Ninja, at least in the first episodes of the sequel, it was impossible to receive all the attributes needed when first rolling characters. This meant the player needed to gain levels to achieve those attributes and then across classes, so they can be considered proper prestige classes. Wizardry 6 allowed starting with any class if the player invested enough time during the random character attribute generation. Influence on subsequent games Wizardry inspired many clones and served as a template for role-playing video games. Some notable series that trace their look and feel to Wizardry include 1985's The Bard's Tale and the Might and Magic series. Wizardry is the major inspiration to the Nintendo DS title The Dark Spire. While the game follows its own story and maps, much of the game uses the same gameplay mechanics, even going so far as including a classic mode that removes all of the game's graphics, replacing them with a wireframe environment, 8-bit style sprites for monsters and characters, and chiptune music. The game's publisher, Atlus, also published another Wizardry spin-off, Wizardry, Tale of the Forsaken Land. While designing the popular Japanese role-playing game Dragon Quest, Yuji Horii drew inspiration from the Wizardry series, 1986's Mugen no Shinzo, and the Ultima series of games. Horii's obsession with Wizardry was manifested as an Easter egg in one of his earlier games, the Portopia serial murder case in 1983. In a dungeon-crawling portion of that adventure game, a note on the wall reads "Monster surprised you." The English fan translation added a side note explaining this is Yuji Horii wishing he could have made this game in a PG like Wizardry. Other legacies The popularity of Wizardry in Japan also inspired various light novels, manga comics, Japanese pen and paper role-playing games, and an original video animation. A popular light novel series titled Sword Art Online also had a character who stated that his inspiration came from this game. Most have been released only in Japan. References. External links, Wizardry series at Moby Games, Wizardry collection page from TK421.net, Wizardry, Torawarashi Damasha no Miku for PS3, Wizardry archives info about the Wizardry games.